Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field may have won him the crown, but it did not guarantee his authority. England in 1485 was a fractured kingdom, weary of civil war but far from unified. As a claimant with a weak hereditary right and little experience of governance, Henry VII faced the enormous challenge of turning military success into political legitimacy. From the very beginning, Henry moved with caution and precision. His first step was to establish that he had not taken the crown by the will of Parliament or by popular demand, but by divine right. He backdated his reign to 21 August 1485, the day before the Battle of Bosworth, making everyone who had fought for Richard III technically traitors. This clever legal move gave him the power to punish his enemies and reward his followers under the letter of the law. To ensure stability, Henry ordered Richard III's burial with dignity, showing respect to his fallen rival and denying Yorkist supporters any grounds for martyrdom. He then moved swiftly to secure his coronation, which was held on 30 October 1485 at Westminster Abbey. Importantly, this was done before Parliament met, again reinforcing that his authority came from royal legitimacy, not parliamentary approval. But perhaps his most politically astute move came in January 1486, when he fulfilled his public promise by marrying Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. But perhaps his most politically astute move came in January 1486, when he fulfilled his public promise by marrying Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. The marriage between Henry VII and Elizabeth of York was well received across England, symbolizing reconciliation after years of dynastic warfare. The creation of the Tudor rose, blending the red of Lancaster and the white of York, became a powerful emblem of unity and renewed hope for lasting peace. Even so, Henry remained deeply aware of the fragility of his position. Many Yorkist nobles had not accepted his rule, and some remained quietly loyal to the old regime. He relied heavily on his mother Margaret Beaufort and trusted allies like Jasper Tudor and John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, while limiting the power of overmighty magnates. Meanwhile, Parliament passed Titulus Regius, a Yorkist decree that had declared Edward IV's marriage invalid and his children illegitimate. This repeal restored Elizabeth of York's legitimacy and strengthened the legal foundation of her marriage to Henry VII. Henry also took steps to strengthen royal finances. Learning from the mistakes of previous kings, he worked to rebuild the treasury and reduce dependence on Parliament for funds. He reasserted control over crown lands, tightened oversight of tax collection, and increased revenues through fines, fees, and customs duties. However, Henry's position was not uncontested. In 1486, rumors began to spread of pretenders and plots. The following year, a serious threat emerged in the form of Lambert Simnel, a boy who was presented as Edward, Earl of Warbeck, the Yorkist heir imprisoned in the Tower of London. Backed by Yorkist exiles and even supported by Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of Edward IV, Simnel's rebellion culminated in the Battle of Stoke Field in June 1487. Henry faced the rebellion with determination. He paraded the real Edward of Warwick through London to expose Simnel's fraud, and his army met and defeated the rebels near Newark. Though smaller than Bosworth, Stokefield was arguably more significant in securing Henry's rule. It marked the final military confrontation of the Wars of the Roses and effectively ended organized Yorkist resistance. Rather than execute Simnel, Henry chose to show clemency. Recognizing the boy as a puppet rather than a threat, he gave him a position in the royal kitchens. By the early 1490s, Henry VII had established a fragile but functioning monarchy. However, his position remained vulnerable. Many Yorkists still refused to accept the legitimacy of the Tudor crown, and foreign powers saw in this instability an opportunity to weaken England by supporting rival claimants. It was in this climate of political uncertainty, a new and more serious threat to Henry's reign emerged in the form of Perkin Warbeck. Warbeck claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had vanished from the Tower, challenging the very legitimacy of the Tudor crown. This claim struck at the very foundation of Henry's rule. If true, Warbeck would have a far superior hereditary claim to the throne. And unlike Simnel, Warbeck was not an English pawn but a carefully managed instrument of foreign courts. Warbeck's origins are murky. He was born around 1474 in Flanders and worked in various households as a servant before, around 1490, claiming royal identity. His story was soon taken up by Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV and Richard III, and a staunch Yorkist exile. Margaret declared Warbeck to be her nephew and gave him her full backing, lending credibility to his claim among Yorkist sympathizers. Warbeck's cause was also supported abroad. He was recognized as Richard, Duke of York, by Charles VIII of France, Emperor Maximilian I, and James IV of Scotland. These endorsements gave him international legitimacy and posed a serious diplomatic and political challenge to Henry. The Pretender made several attempts to invade England between 1495 and 1497. The first in 1495 failed completely when Warbeck's landing at Deal in Kent was quickly repelled by Henry's forces. The following year he found refuge in Scotland, where James IV gave him both military support and a Scottish noblewoman as a wife. In 1496, Warbeck and a small Scottish force crossed the English border but failed to gain local support and soon retreated. In 1497, taking advantage of a Cornish rebellion sparked by tax grievances, Warbeck landed in Cornwall and declared himself king. He marched inland and attempted to rally support but found little enthusiasm. Lacking the resources and public backing, he was forced to surrender to Henry's forces at Beaulieu Abbey. Unlike previous pretenders, Warbeck was not immediately executed. Henry imprisoned him, first in relatively lenient conditions, likely to avoid making him a martyr. But after a failed escape attempt and involvement in a suspected plot to overthrow the king alongside Edward, Earl of Warwick, Perkin, Warbeck's fate was sealed. In 1499, both men were executed, effectively removing the last serious dynastic threats to Henry VII's claim to the throne. With the threat of pretenders finally behind him, Henry focused more intensively on strengthening the kingdom from within. Henry continued to use bonds and recognizances to enforce loyalty, placing financial pressure on noble families to ensure their obedience. These measures were effective but increasingly unpopular, and they contributed to the perception of Henry as a controlling and cautious monarch. In 1492, he signed the Treaty of Étaples with France, under which the French agreed to stop supporting Warbeck and paid Henry a generous annual pension in exchange for English withdrawal from French soil. Perhaps the most significant diplomatic achievement of Henry's middle reign was the marriage alliance between Prince Arthur, his eldest son and heir, and Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. The Treaty of Medina del Campo, signed in 1489 and finalized in the following years, brought England closer to the rising power of Spain and enhanced the prestige of the Tudor dynasty on the European stage. The marriage took place in 1501, further solidifying Henry's legitimacy and positioning his dynasty for continuity. Despite these successes, Henry's reign was not without hardship. His financial policies, while effective in stabilizing the crown's income, created resentment among both nobles and commoners. Agents like Empson and Dudley, who enforced royal revenues, became symbols of royal overreach and oppression. Still, Henry remained committed to strengthening the monarchy, reducing reliance on Parliament, and building a strong fiscal foundation for his successors. But beneath the surface of political stability, the Tudor dynasty would soon be tested by personal tragedy and uncertainty over succession. The marriage of Prince Arthur to Catherine of Aragon had been celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy. Arthur, intelligent and well-educated, had been raised from birth to be king. He embodied Henry VIII's vision for a strong and legitimate royal legacy. Yet that future was abruptly shaken. In April 1502, only 5 months after his wedding, Arthur fell seriously ill at Ludlow Castle, the administrative center of his future Principality of Wales. Despite efforts to save him, he died at the age of 15. The cause remains uncertain, but the effect was immediate and profound. Arthur's death devastated the royal court. It not only robbed Henry of his beloved heir, but threatened the long-term stability of the Tudor succession. The entire dynastic plan, carefully built over 2 decades, now rested on Henry's second son, Prince Henry, just 10 years old at the time. In February 1503, Elizabeth of York, Henry's queen and the mother of his children, died shortly after giving birth to a daughter, who also died in infancy. The double tragedy of losing both his heir and his wife marked a turning point in Henry's reign. Once cautious but composed, the king became increasingly withdrawn and suspicious. The influence of officials like Empson and Dudley expanded, and their aggressive enforcement of taxation and legal penalties deepened resentment across the kingdom. Even as Henry grew more reclusive, he remained committed to securing the future of the Tudor dynasty. He opened negotiations with Spain to ensure that Catherine of Aragon would remain in England and eventually marry Prince Henry, a union that would require special papal permission. In the final years of his life, Henry VII began laying the groundwork for a smooth succession. He involved Prince Henry more in court life and administration. On 21 April 1509, after a long illness, likely a combination of tuberculosis and other chronic conditions, Henry VII died at Richmond Palace, aged 52. He was buried beside Elizabeth of York in Westminster Abbey under a magnificent tomb commissioned by their son. His son Henry VIII would inherit not just the throne, but the full weight of his father's legacy and the freedom to rule without the constant threat of rebellion.